They said an Omega could never survive. Could never fight. Could never matter. And in the brutal world of wolves, they were usually right. Because she was born with nothing. No powerful bloodline. No alpha father. No pack strong enough to protect her. No destiny waiting with open arms. She was the kind of girl the world stepped on and forgot. The kind of girl powerful wolves looked through like she didn't exist. An Omega. Weak. Disposable. Powerless. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. Because far beyond the northern mountains, behind iron walls stained by war, ruled a king no one dared challenge. The deadliest werewolf king to ever live. A man wrapped in shadows. A ruler so feared that enemies surrendered before battle even began. No one had ever seen his true face and lived to speak of it. Kings feared him. Alphas obeyed him. Even monsters whispered his name carefully. He could not be conquered. He could not be broken. And yet, the impossible happened. The king the entire world feared fell. Not to war. Not to betrayal. Not to silver. He fell to an Omega. To the girl no one believed could survive. The forgotten girl. The broken girl. The girl who was never supposed to matter. But before she could bring a king to his knees, he almost destroyed her first. This is not a story about a weak girl waiting for someone to save her. This is the story of an Omega who turned pain into power. And became the nightmare of everyone who ever underestimated her. But the real question is, what was hiding beneath the king's mask? And why did the most dangerous man alive choose her? If you love powerful revenge, dangerous romance, and shocking secrets, subscribe and stay till the end, and don't forget to like and share your thoughts in comment section. Because this story, it only gets darker from here. Now, let's begin. The forest did not love her. It simply tolerated her the way old things tolerate the small and persistent. The roots did not move aside for her boots. The branches did not part to let in more light. But they also did not swallow her, and in the Blackmoor wilderness, that counted for something. Seraphine Ashvale moved through the dark like a creature born knowing how to disappear. Her dark brown hair was unbound, tangled with pine needles and the evidence of 3 days without shelter. She was 19, lean with the kind of muscle that comes not from training but from surviving, her deep amber eyes sharp and restless even when the rest of her face held the practiced stillness of someone who had learned that showing feeling was the same as showing weakness. She wore worn leather breeches tucked into knee-high boots cracked at the heel, a long dark tunic belted at the waist, and a coat that had belonged to her mother before the woman had been torn apart at the border of the Crimson Pack territory 7 years ago. The coat was too large, the seams repaired so many times they looked like old scars, and Seraphine wore it with the reverence most people reserved for armor. She carried no sword. She carried a hunting knife, a coil of rope, and a small leather pouch of dried root herbs that could slow blood loss if pressed into a wound. That was everything she owned in the world. And she was running. Not from fear. Fear was a luxury she had stopped permitting herself at 13. She was running because 3 hunters from the Iron Teeth Pack had picked up her scent an hour ago at the river crossing, and Omega blood on Iron Teeth territory was considered fair sport. The pack law was old and brutal and perfectly legal under every treaty still standing in the northern wolf lands. Omegas did not have pack protection. Omegas did not have rights. Omegas were simply there, at the bottom of the hierarchy, useful when needed and invisible when not, tolerated until the day they became inconvenient. And Seraphine had been inconvenient the moment she had been born, because Omega daughters of dead Omega mothers were supposed to pledge to whatever pack found them first, and Seraphine had never pledged to anyone. She had run instead. She had been running for 6 years. The sound behind her changed, 3 sets of heavy boots becoming 2, and her stomach clenched. One of them had shifted. She heard it in the wet crack of bone and the guttural grunt that followed, heard it in the way the forest itself seemed to exhale with something between anticipation and dread. Seraphine did not stop. She bent low as she ran, calculating the terrain by instinct. Ravine 40 feet ahead, hidden by undergrowth. Too wide to jump in human form, too risky in wolf form because she did not trust her shift, had never been trained to trust it, had only shifted twice in her life and both times had nearly broken her from the inside. She veered left. Up the ridge. Harder footing, but the scent would break differently in the cold air above the tree line. She heard the wolf hit the ground behind her, a massive shape that moved through the trees like a battering ram, all power and no subtlety. Iron-teeth wolves ran big, their shifts producing gray and black beasts with shoulders like oxen, bred for territory wars and not for tracking. They were fast in open ground. In the dense tangle of blackmoor pines, they were loud. That was the first mistake they made. Seraphine made her second appearance at the top of the ridge, deliberately visible for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the wolf below to redirect, and then she dropped flat behind a boulder and pressed herself against cold stone and breathed through her nose, slow and controlled, the way she had taught herself to breathe in the 4 years she had spent hiding in caves and hollow trees and the ruins of old settlements. The wolf crashed past below her, chasing the scent trail she had left, and kept going. The 2 humans followed. She waited until their sounds faded and then she stood and turned east, and that was when she saw the light. It came from between the trees, too steady for fire, too blue-white for torch, and it pulsed the way living things pulse, rhythmically and with purpose. She had heard stories of the witch-light border markers that surrounded the Ashen Crown territory, the domain of the Wolf King, the great northern lord who held power over every pack from the ice coast to the granite mountains of the south. She had also heard what happened to those who crossed into Ashen Crown territory uninvited. They did not come back. Seraphine looked behind her. She looked at the light. She walked toward the light. It was not bravery. It was mathematics. 3 hunters plus 1 shifted wolf behind her equaled certain death. The unknowable territory ahead equaled possible death. Possible was better than certain. She had built her entire life on that particular calculation. The witch lights hummed as she passed between them, and she felt the border crossing like a hand pressed flat against her chest, a pressure that asked something of her, some declaration of intent, and she pushed back against it with the only honest answer she had. I am trying to survive. That is all. I am always only trying to survive. The pressure released. She was inside. The trees changed immediately. The pines became old-growth oak, enormous and cathedral-spaced, their canopies so high above that the sky between them looked like scattered cathedral glass. The ground was carpeted in moss that muffled every footstep. The air smelled of iron and cedar and something else, something that lived under the other sense the way a heartbeat lives under the sound of breathing. Power. Ancient and personal and completely uninterested in her presence. She had gone perhaps a quarter mile inside the border when she heard them. Not hunters. These moved differently, 4 of them, positioned around her before she had even registered the first sound, which meant they had known she was coming before she arrived. Border guards of the Ashen Crown wore no identifying marks, no clan colors, no pack insignia. They wore black, all of them, leather and iron, and the expression of people who had stopped being surprised by anything. The one who stepped forward was a woman, broad-shouldered and silver-haired despite looking no older than 30, with wolf-gray eyes that catalogued Seraphine the way a soldier catalogues a threat and then deliberately revises their assessment. Her voice came out level and without warmth. Trespasser. State your pack and your business on Crown land. Seraphine met those gray eyes without blinking. No pack. My business is that I crossed your border to avoid being killed by iron-teeth hunters. I will leave the same way I came in once they have cleared the ridge. I ask nothing of the crown and I take nothing from it. A silence followed this that Seraphine could not read. The silver-haired guard studied her with an expression caught between professional skepticism and something that might have been reluctant curiosity. You are Omega. Not a question. Seraphine answered it anyway. Yes. And you crossed the witchlight border alone. Yes. The woman looked at the other 3 guards. Something passed between them, wordless and swift as a wing beat. When she looked back at Seraphine, the assessment in her eyes had shifted. The border crossing reads intent, she informed her. It turns back those who carry malice and it tests those who carry uncertainty. In 12 years of service I have seen 400 trespassers attempt this crossing. 273 were turned back. Of the remaining, most were authorized agents of allied pacts or crown-sanctioned traders. She paused. In 12 years, you are the third unaffiliated Omega I have seen the border let through. Seraphine felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the night air. What happened to the first two? The guard held her gaze. They were brought to the king. Seraphine understood then what was happening. She also understood that she had no leverage and no options and that fighting 4 crown guards on crown territory would accomplish nothing except providing her own death more quickly. She lifted her chin. Then take me to the king. The silver-haired woman almost smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was the expression of someone acknowledging that the world had produced an interesting puzzle. Follow us. The fortress of the Ashen Crown was not what stories made it. Stories always described it as black and terrible, a monument to conquest and fear, the kind of architecture that existed to remind people how small they were. In truth, it was massive and ancient and entirely focused on function, walls built from gray stone quarried in the mountain hearts, towers that served as watchtowers and not as decoration, gates of iron so old they had grown dark amber at the hinges. It was not beautiful. It was permanent. There was something almost more frightening about that. Seraphine was taken through the outer gates, through a second set of walls, and into an inner courtyard where torches burned in iron baskets and a dozen more guards moved through the space with the unhurried efficiency of people who had never in their lives doubted their own capability. No one stared at her. No one spoke about her. She was processed with the same calm attention one might give to any other unusual arrival, and that neutrality was somehow more unnerving than hostility would have been. She was not bound. She was not searched. She was simply walked through the fortress with 4 guards at careful distances, the silver-haired woman at her left, and delivered to a set of doors so tall they would have admitted a mounted rider without ducking. Wait here, the guard told her. Seraphine waited. She counted her own heartbeats to keep herself steady. She had learned this in her years of running, that the mind goes soft when panic sets in, and a soft mind could not solve the problems a hard world kept presenting. So she counted. She observed. She memorized the placement of the 2 guards flanking the great doors. She noted the secondary exit to her left, a narrower door set into the wall, the kind of door that exists for staff and not for ceremony. She was still calculating when the great doors opened. The room beyond was a war chamber, long and stone-floored, lit by iron chandeliers holding perhaps 50 candles each. The walls hung not with tapestries but with maps, detailed and methodical and covering every territory she had ever heard of and several she had not. A long table ran the center of the room, scarred from decades of use, covered in documents and sealed letters and the scattered evidence of decisions being made. And at the far end of the table, standing with his back to her as he studied the largest map on the wall, was the king. Seraphine had expected many things. She had expected armor, the ceremonial kind that powerful men wear when they want to be seen as powerful. She had expected the posture of someone accustomed to being watched, that particular self-conscious authority that packed alphas performed at every gathering. He wore neither. He wore a dark tunic under a heavy coat of black wool, his sleeves pushed to the elbow in the manner of someone deep in work rather than reception. He was tall, genuinely tall in a way that had nothing to do with performance, and broad through the shoulders and chest in the manner of a man who had spent his life in physical use of his body. His hair was dark as walnut bark and kept short. His hands, visible where they rested against the map table, were scarred across the knuckles. He wore a mask. This was not in any story she had heard, and stories about the Wolf King were the primary currency of every campfire in the Northern Territories. The mask covered the right side of his face from temple to jaw, a fitted thing of dark iron worked into curves that might have been decorative if they did not fit so precisely to bone. It left the left side of his face fully visible, and what she could see was angular and severe, a jaw like carved stone, a mouth held in a line that suggested a man who had not smiled carelessly in a long time. He did not turn when she entered. He spoke without turning, his voice low and unhurried and carrying the kind of weight that lives in old wood and granite. You crossed my border without invitation, without pack affiliation, and without apparent fear. I am told the border read you clean. Seraphine stayed where she was, 10 feet inside the door. Yes. He turned then. The visible half of his face was perhaps 30, perhaps older, the kind of age that is not measured in years but in experience. His visible eye was the color of winter sky, pale gray-blue, and entirely without warmth or hostility, simply watching, the way a predator watches something it has not yet classified as prey or otherwise. The iron mask caught the candlelight. She looked at it without looking away, because looking away from something you were afraid of was the first and most fatal mistake. His gaze moved across her with the same cataloging efficiency the border guard had shown, and then it stopped and stayed on her face. What is your name? Seraphine Ashvale. Ashvale, he repeated, as though tasting the name for something. You carry a dead line. The Ashvale were Omega Line out of the southeastern river territories. They were absorbed into Crimson Pack 8 years ago. 7 years ago, she corrected, and felt the precision of her own correction hanging in the air between them like a weapon she had not intended to draw. My mother was killed at the border absorption. I was 12. Something moved across the visible half of his face. It was not pity. It was recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has been present when something irreversible happened and has carried the shape of that moment ever since. You have been running since then. She did not answer. The answer was in her boots and her coat and the knife at her belt that had been sharpened so many times the blade was narrower than when it was made. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the attention of it like a physical pressure, and then he turned back to the map on the wall. You will be housed in the East Quarter tonight, he pronounced. Tomorrow you will be evaluated for placement. You are not a prisoner, but you will not leave Crown territory until that evaluation is complete. Those are the terms for anyone the border permits entry without credentials. Seraphine studied his back. I do not accept terms I have not agreed to. The room went very still. The 2 guards near the door made the smallest of movements, the instinctive tension of people who had never heard those particular words spoken in this particular room. The king did not move. He did not speak immediately. The silence was long enough that Seraphine counted to 11 before he responded. When he spoke, his voice had not changed. And yet somehow it carried something it had not carried before, not anger, something more like the very edge of curiosity. What terms would you accept? She breathed out slowly. 1 night of shelter in exchange for information about Iron Teeth movements along your eastern border. I have been through their territory twice in the past month. I know their patrol patterns and their current pack count. That information has value. Another silence. He turned from the map. He crossed the room toward her with the particular unhurried stride of someone who has never needed to rush because the world waits for them, and he stopped 3 feet from her and looked down at her face from a height that would have made most people in her position step back. She did not step back. His visible eye was doing something complicated. He was close enough now that she could see the ironwork of the mask in detail, the way it was anchored at his temple and cheekbone, fitted precisely, worn with the ease of long habit. It was old. It was not decorative. It was a thing of absolute purpose, and she would not ask about it because asking about a person's wounds was an intimacy she had not earned. He extended his hand, palm up, between them. The gesture was formal and old, the way wolf packs had once sealed agreements before the law of signatures replaced the law of touch. 1 night of shelter and a hot meal, he offered. In exchange for the Iron Teeth intelligence. And your name added to the crown roll as a person under border protection for the duration of your stay. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and brief and entirely correct, the grip of someone who had done this enough times that it carried no performance. But when he released her hand and stepped back, she caught something in the set of his jaw that had not been there before. Attention. A thing that did not belong to the business of the moment. She filed it away in the same place she filed everything that might matter later. A guard will show you to your quarters, he informed her, already moving back toward his maps. I will hear the Iron Teeth intelligence at dawn. Seraphine followed the guard to the door and then stopped. She was not sure why she stopped. She was not sure why she turned. She addressed his back one more time. Thank you for the border protection. He did not turn. He did not respond with words. But his hand, resting against the map table, closed slowly into a fist. She left. She did not sleep that night. She lay on the cleanest bed she had occupied in 6 years, in a stone room that smelled of cedar and old fire, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about a king who wore an iron mask and extended his hand in the old way and had the voice of someone accustomed to speaking in a room where no one disagreed. She thought about how he had said her name. Not Omega. Seraphine Ashvale. Like it meant something. She pressed her thumb against the palm the king had touched and held it there until she slept. His name was Selim Voss. Not the Wolf King. Not the Ashen Crown. Not the Iron Mask, which was what the Southern Pax called him in the stories they told to frighten their children into obedience. His name was Selim Voss, and he had been born the third son of a line of kings and had worn a crown by 30 because his father and both brothers were dead before that year. He knew this about himself: he was not built for softness. He had been taught by war and loss and the particular education of watching everyone you love be taken from you by a world that does not negotiate. He had built the Ashen Crown into what it was through a combination of strategic alliance, absolute enforcement of border law, and a personal reputation for being impossible to manipulate, bribe, or threaten. No one who looked at him long enough to matter ever looked only at the mask. They looked at the mask and they looked away and they kept their eyes slightly averted thereafter, which was the practical goal. People who were slightly averted were easier to read. People who were trying not to stare at your face were not watching your hands, your posture, the micro-expressions that a trained eye could harvest into intelligence. He had built the mask into a weapon over 15 years. The Omega girl had looked directly at it. Not with the avid curiosity of someone collecting gossip. Not with the particular unease of someone trying to pretend they were not repulsed. She had looked at it the way she had looked at the rest of him, with the calm attention of someone cataloging things that might matter later, and then she had moved her gaze to his face and spoken to him the way she would have spoken to anyone. As an equal. He had stood in his war room after she left and spent longer than he would acknowledge staring at the map he was no longer seeing, turning over the fact of her in his mind the way you turn a strange stone over in your hand, examining the weight of it. She was Omega. She had been alone for 6 years. She had negotiated with him. He had let her. This last fact was the one that kept him standing at the map table after everyone else had gone, because it was not a fact he could explain with the usual rules. He did not accept renegotiated terms. He did not extend border protection on the word of an unaffiliated trespasser. He certainly did not find himself thinking about a woman 10 minutes after she had left the room. And yet, the next morning he received her in the same war room, this time with his senior intelligence officer, Commander Yara Stonefeld, the silver-haired woman who had found her at the border, present in the corner with a journal and a careful expression. Seraphine Ashvale arrived on time. She had been given water and clean clothing from the general supply that all crown guests received, practical dark wool trousers and a gray shirt and boots that fit, and she had taken them and worn them without ceremony, which meant she understood the difference between accepting practical hospitality and incurring obligation. She sat across the table from him and told him what she knew. It was not sparse intelligence. It was precise, thorough, delivered with the specificity of someone who had spent months moving invisibly through enemy territory. The Iron Teeth were shifting their patrol lines eastward, she explained. 2 new watchtowers in the past 3 months, both positioned to observe the river crossing at the Blackmoor Narrows. They had brought in an additional 40 fighters from their Southern Alliance and were rotating their senior tracker unit through the border zone in shifts of 12. Which meant they were anticipating a specific kind of incursion and not a general security increase. Commander Stonefeld wrote continuously. Selim watched Seraphine speak. She spoke without flourish and without the nervous qualifications of someone trying to make their information sound more valuable than it was. She did not embellish. She did not seek his reaction. She stated what she had seen and what she had concluded from what she had seen, and she drew the distinction between observed fact and inference with a precision that most of his trained intelligence operatives did not consistently achieve. When she finished, Yara Stonefeld looked up from her journal and met Selim's gaze across the room. He recognized the look. It was the look his most experienced officer gave him when she had encountered something she could not immediately categorize, which was a thing that happened perhaps twice a year. He looked back at Seraphine. How long were you in Iron Teeth territory? 6 weeks total over 4 separate entries, she told him. I was tracking the supply route from the Southern Alliance. They have a trader network that moves through the Blackmoor on the new moon, when the forest is dark enough to cover the cargo wagons. The cargo is weapons. What kind? Silver. Refined and pressed. Ingots and finished pieces both. A silence followed this that carried different weight than the previous ones. Silver was not a trading commodity among wolf packs. Silver had exactly one purpose in the relationships between werewolf clans, and that purpose was harm. Yara closed her journal. Where did the supply line originate? I tracked it 3 days south before I lost it at the garrison town of Vethmore, Seraphine answered. They switched the cargo to unmarked wagons there. The original wagons carried a crest I did not recognize, 3 rings interlocked, no color preserved on the woodwork. Yara made a sound that was very quiet and very controlled. Selim held perfectly still. He knew that crest. 3 rings were the mark of the Pale Conclave, the network of human silver merchants who had been outlawed from every major territory after the border wars of 12 years ago, the same wars that had taken his father and brothers and left the right side of his face permanently damaged. The Pale Conclave were supposed to be scattered. Gone. He made himself breathe evenly and looked at the woman across the table who had walked 6 weeks through enemy territory alone and come out the other side with intelligence that had just changed the shape of his next 6 months. Who are you? He asked, and the question came out differently than he intended. Not a demand. Not an interrogation. Something that belonged to a more honest register. She met his gaze without evasion. I told you. Seraphine Ashvale. Omega. No pack. That is what you are in the world's ledger, he noted. I asked who you are. The distinction landed. He saw it land, watched her process it, watched something shift very slightly in the set of her jaw. I am someone who learned early that surviving required knowing more than the people trying to kill me, she answered at last. So I watch. I learn. I remember. He considered this. And what have you learned about me? She did not hesitate. That you are more careful than dangerous stories require. That you extended border protection through the formal touch rather than a written document, which means you value old law over bureaucratic law. That you work alone most hours, which means you do not trust easily but are not afraid of your own company. And that the mask is old enough to be structural and not cosmetic, which means whatever happened to your face happened long enough ago that you have built your entire public identity around the fact of it rather than in spite of it. The room was very quiet. Yara Stonefeld was looking at the far wall with the particular expression of someone choosing not to witness a private moment. Selim Voss had not been read that cleanly by anyone in a very long time. He should have dismissed her. Should have thanked her for the intelligence and directed Yara to process her departure as per standard border guest protocol, 1 night of shelter and a meal and safe passage back to the border. Instead he heard himself offer her something he had not planned to offer. The Pale Conclave intelligence requires follow-up in Vethmore, he stated. I am sending a team south in 4 days. Your knowledge of the routes and the specific wagon markings would be of value. He paused, because the next part required precision. The role would be classified as a Crown operative assignment. Temporary. Paid. With full border protection for the duration. He watched her face. She watched his. You are offering me employment. I am offering you a defined and bounded assignment with clearly stated terms. What you do after its completion is entirely your own business." She was quiet for long enough that he began to believe she would refuse, and then she set both hands flat on the table in a gesture that was not quite the formal sealing touch but lived in the same category. "3 conditions," she said. He almost smiled. "Speak them." "I operate independently within the team structure. I do not take orders that contradict my own risk assessment. I keep my own knife." She paused. "And no one in the field unit tells me what I am or am not capable of on the basis of rank designation." She meant Omega. He understood she meant Omega. He met her gaze. "Accepted. The team departs at dawn in 4 days. Yara will brief you on the mission parameters tomorrow morning." She nodded and stood and moved toward the door. He stopped himself from saying her name. He did not know why he wanted to. She paused at the door anyway, as though she had heard something he had not said, and looked back at him over her shoulder. Her amber eyes in the candlelight were the color of fire in deep honey. He made himself look at the map. She left. He stood in the war room for a long time. The 4 days passed in the texture of preparation. Seraphine learned the mission parameters from Yara Stonefeld, who briefed her with the same crisp efficiency she applied to everything, and who looked at her, occasionally, with an expression that Seraphine could not quite decode. Not hostility. Not the professional neutrality she had expected. Something closer to watchfulness. She met the team. 3 Crown operatives, seasoned and scarred and carrying the quiet confidence of people who had been in difficult places and come out intact. They received her with the careful neutrality of professionals who had been told, presumably by someone with authority, to regard her as a colleague and not a liability. She spent the days moving through the fortress, learning its geography with the same attention she had given to every territory she had ever needed to survive. She located the water sources, the secondary exits, the kitchens, and the armory and the quiet corridors where servants moved with the efficiency of a well-run system. She did not see the king. She was aware, in the way she was aware of weather and terrain, that this was not accidental. On the 3rd night, she was in the East Quarter courtyard, in the cold air under an overcast sky, running through the forms she had taught herself from watching trained fighters in the settlement markets. She wore only the borrowed shirt and trousers, barefoot on cold stone, moving through the sequence with the focus that made her feel most like herself. She had just finished the 7th form when she became aware she was being watched. She knew it was him before she turned. She was not sure how. Something in the quality of the air, the particular stillness of a large person standing very still, or perhaps some instinct she had not named that had been paying attention to him in a way she had not authorized. He stood at the edge of the courtyard near the archway, coat on against the cold, arms crossed, watching her with the same expressionless attention he gave to maps and intelligence reports. She stopped moving and faced him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he uncrossed his arms and moved into the courtyard, not toward her but to the open center of the space, and he took a stance she recognized from the 7th form, the open guard position, the starting position of the combat sequence she had been practicing. He looked at her. She understood. She moved to face him. They ran through the form together, slowly at first, not contact but parallel, and she adjusted the angle of her grip and the placement of her leading foot by watching the corrections in his body, the small but precise differences between self-taught and trained. They did the sequence 3 times. They did not speak. On the 4th run she moved inside his guard without intending to, a half-step too close, and for a fraction of a second her shoulder was against his chest and his hand was at her hip, correcting her weight, and the contact was brief and entirely practical and she felt it for the rest of the night. He stepped back. She stepped back. They regarded each other across 2 feet of cold courtyard air. "Your 6th form transition is off," he said at last. "You are overcommitting the left shoulder." She breathed out. "I know." He looked at her face, really looked, the way he had looked at her across the war room table, and then he turned and left the courtyard without another word. Seraphine stood alone on the cold stone and pressed her hand flat against her sternum and felt her own heartbeat working harder than the physical exertion warranted. Vethmore was a garrison town that smelled of iron and old money and the particular desperation of people living at the edge of multiple competing powers. It sat in a valley between two territorial boundaries, technically neutral, which in practice meant it was owned by whoever could afford the most guards and the least scruple at any given moment. The team entered at dusk on the second day of travel, dressed as trading company scouts, which was a cover that suited the work and did not require conversation. Seraphine had been given a cloak of dark green wool and a merchant's identification token, and she wore both without discomfort, because she had worn more elaborate disguises in worse circumstances. Selim Voss was not supposed to be with them. He was with them. This had been announced to the team on the morning of departure with the same matter-of-fact delivery that Yara used for everything, the kind that left no room for question or comment, and Seraphine had looked at him across the courtyard and read nothing in his face and then looked away and reminded herself that this was a professional assignment and she was a professional. He had removed the iron mask. Not entirely. He wore, in its place, a half-mask of dark leather that covered the same area, fitted closely enough to pass as a traveler's face protection against road dust. It was a concession to the practicality of moving through a public town where an iron court mask would draw every eye in the market. No one who did not know him would look twice. But Seraphine, who had been paying attention to his face since the first night, could see the difference. The leather mask sat slightly differently than the iron one. It was less precise. And without the weight of iron, the visible half of his face was slightly more mobile, not expressive in any careless way, but carrying more of the subtle movement of thought and attention that the iron had suppressed. She found this information more dangerous than she wanted it to be. They located the warehouse district near the garrison wall and the team split, 2 operatives to the market quarter to gather soft intelligence, 1 to monitor the main southern road, Yara maintaining communication at a central position. Seraphine took the back alleys near the river freight docks, because the wagons she had tracked 3 weeks ago had come in from the south road but been offloaded near water, and water-adjacent storage in a garrison town meant either perishables or things that needed to leave quickly. Selim came with her. Again, not by plan. He simply fell into step beside her when she moved toward the dock quarter, and she did not comment because commenting would have acknowledged something she was not ready to acknowledge. They moved through the narrow streets without speech, and she discovered that he moved through a crowd with the same quality she had noted in the courtyard, taking up space without announcing it, present in a way that altered the energy of whatever immediate environment he occupied without drawing obvious attention. She found the warehouse in the third alley from the riverfront. Not by sight. By smell. Silver had a smell, bright and cold and slightly bitter, perceptible to wolf senses at low concentrations if you knew what you were looking for. She had learned this the hard way, 3 years ago, in a building outside the Crimson Pack territory where she had nearly walked into a silver trap set for exactly the kind of lone Omega who was too watchful to catch any other way. She stopped walking. Selim stopped beside her. She turned her head slightly left. Second building. Loading dock on the riverside. He inhaled once, slowly. Then a pause that stretched for several seconds. Then a breath out. He looked at her with something that passed across his visible eye too. Quickly to name. You can detect silver at this concentration? She looked back at him. Can you not? He did not answer this. She filed it away. They moved to the building separately, taking different approach lines, meeting at the wall beside the loading dock where a single guard stood with the too relaxed posture of someone doing long hours of standing and no longer expecting anything to happen. Seraphine took the guard. Not violently. She used the pressure point behind the jaw that produced unconsciousness for approximately 20 minutes, a technique she had learned from a wandering field medic who had been drunk enough to teach her things he would have known not to share sober. She caught the man before he hit the ground and Selim was at her shoulder a half-second later, taking the weight and lowering it without a sound. They looked at each other. She almost laughed. She did not. The interior of the warehouse confirmed everything and added more. The silver ingots were crated in pine boxes marked with grain merchant stamps, but the crates themselves were lined with woven iron mesh to prevent the smell from carrying, which was why she had only caught it at the dock. There were more crates than the Iron Teeth supply line warranted. Far more. Selim moved through the rows counting while she checked the crate markings for origin stamps. She found them on the third row, pressed into the wood on the inside base of each crate. A specific merchant mark, a crowned serpent biting its own tail, which was the stamp of a specific silver processing facility in the far south that had been declared destroyed 11 years ago. She straightened and turned to tell him what she had found and walked directly into his chest. He caught her by the upper arms before the momentum translated into both of them going into the crates, and they stood for a fraction of a second that lasted considerably longer, her hands braced against his coat, his hands on her arms. Close enough that she could see the fine detail of the leather mask and the line of his jaw beneath it. He released her immediately. She stepped back. The air between them had changed. She knew what it was. She was 19 and she had never been ignorant of physical reality, and she recognized the change as the body making an argument the mind had not authorized. She recognized it and she locked it behind the same door she kept everything that was not immediately useful to survival. She held up the crate stamp so he could see it. The crowned serpent. His jaw tightened. That facility was supposed to be rubble, she noted. It is, he answered, his voice even. That stamp indicates the processing is now mobile. They have rebuilt the operation on moving infrastructure. No fixed location to destroy. He looked at her. How did you know the stamp was on the interior base? She met his gaze evenly. Because that is where I would hide it. They documented what they could and withdrew before the unconscious guard's absence became a pattern irregularity. On the way back through the dock alley, moving quickly and close together in the narrow space, Selim spoke without looking at her. You were never trained. She did not pretend to misunderstand. No. How long have you been operating at this level? She considered the question genuinely. Since I needed to. His stride did not change. His profile in the dim alley light was angular and still. Something in the set of his shoulders carried a weight she recognized as complicated feeling pressed into physical form. You should have been trained, he said, and it came out not as judgment but as something close to grief. She looked at the alley ahead of them. Omegas are not offered training. No, he agreed. They are not. The silence that followed was different from previous silences. It was the silence of two people who had arrived at the same understanding from different directions and were now standing in it together. They emerged from the alley into the main market street and a great deal happened in the next 4 seconds. A horn sounded from the garrison wall. People began to move in the urgent, directionless way of a crowd responding to alarm without information. And 3 iron-teeth wolves in human form stepped out of the tavern across the street and looked directly at Selim. They recognized him. Even with the leather mask. Even without the court armor and the iron crown. They recognized him, or recognized something, and the recognition moved across their faces like a stone dropped in water, and what rose up behind it was not fear. It was the particular decision of people who understood they were looking at a valuable target. The largest of the 3 reached inside his coat. Seraphine moved. She did not think about it. She did not decide to do it. She moved the way she had learned to move in 6 years of survival, without consultation with the conscious part of her mind, the body making choices faster than language allows. She stepped left and in front of Selim, and her hand went to the wrist of the large man before his hand had cleared his coat, and she twisted with the specific leverage of the technique she had spent 3 years perfecting, the one that put an opponent on the ground without requiring greater physical strength. The man went down. The second was already moving. Seraphine felt the shift coming before it started, felt it in the change of air pressure that large biological change produces, and she caught the knife from her own belt and put it flat against the man's throat as he began to drop to his knees in the first stage of the wolf form transition. Stop, she said. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The man stopped. His eyes, already bleeding to wolf amber in the partial shift, fixed on her face. She held his gaze without looking away. The third Iron Teeth operative had taken 3 steps to flank when Selim moved, and that was the end of the flanking maneuver. She heard rather than saw it, the contained efficiency of it, and then the third man was on the ground and Selim was standing and the crowd had given them a wide and widening berth. She released the second operative. He did not complete the shift. He looked at her with the half-transformed eyes of a wolf who has been told no by something his instincts could not dismiss and made the decision to go, pulling his unconscious colleague up from the cobblestones and retrieving the third from whatever position Selim had deposited him in. They left. Seraphine exhaled. She turned and found Selim very close, not touching, watching her with an expression that was doing something she had never seen on his face before. The leather mask covered half of it. The other half was entirely unguarded. She looked at him and did not look away. The unguarded half of his face told her things she had not been given permission to know. She filed them in the place she had been filing everything about him since the first night, and she was running out of room in that particular archive. They regrouped with the team and left Vethmore before the garrison patrol changed shift. On the first night of the return journey, camped in the Blackmoor with the firelight keeping the dark at edges, Seraphine woke at the third hour to the sound of one person awake when everyone should have been sleeping. She found Selim at the edge of the firelight, sitting on a log with his back partially to the camp, the leather mask removed, facing the dark. This was the first time she had seen his face uncovered. The right side bore the evidence of old burning, a sweep of old scar tissue from temple to jaw, the skin healed but permanently altered, the texture different from everything around it. It was not grotesque. It was not what the story suggested. It was simply the face of a man who had been through fire and carried it with him. She sat down on the log beside him without asking permission. He did not move to cover his face. They sat in silence for a long time. Then she said, quietly, "How old were you?" 17, he replied, after a pause long enough that she had begun to think he would not answer. The border wars. The pale conclave set fire to the eastern garrison while my father was negotiating a treaty inside. My father and brothers did not get out. She was quiet. He continued. I was outside. I went back in for them. I found 2 of them before the fire made it impossible to continue. The scar is from the second attempt. She looked at his profile, the whole of it now, the scarred side visible in the firelight, and she understood something about him that all the cataloging of the past week had been building toward but had not yet arrived at. He had built everything he was on the foundation of what he could not save. She knew something about that. She said, without looking away from the fire, my mother told me to run. When the Crimson Pack came for the border absorption. She said run and do not stop, and I ran and I heard her stop behind me and I did not stop. He looked at her. She kept her eyes on the fire. I have run every day since. Not from fear. She paused. Because she told me to. Because stopping felt like making what she did not matter. He was very still beside her. She turned and looked at him directly, at the whole of his face, and let him see that she was looking and that what she saw did not change her expression or her regard. He looked back at her. His expression was doing the thing it had done in Vethmore, except now there was no half-mask to constrain it and she had the full account of it, and it was the most undefended thing she had ever seen on a person who had made a practice of being indefensible. The fire crackled between them and the dark held them and the forest kept its ancient uninvested silence. His hand found hers on the log between them. Not clasping. Just contact. Just the edge of his hand against the edge of hers, like a question asked so quietly that neither of them had to answer. She did not move her hand. Neither did he. They sat until the fire went low and then returned to their respective places in the camp without a word, and in the morning neither of them referenced it and both of them were perfectly normal and professional, and she caught him looking at her over breakfast and he caught her looking at him and they both looked away. Yara Stonefeld, who had slept in the camp and presumably had not been awake in the third hour and could not possibly know anything, spent the morning with the particular expression of someone who knew everything. They returned to the Ashen Crown Fortress on the 5th day to find it under siege. Not a direct assault. A political siege, which was in many ways more dangerous, because you could not fight a political siege with claws and silver bare iron. The Iron Teeth Alpha Lord had sent a formal delegation of challenge to the Crown Gates, invoking the ancient law of pack dominion, a law so old it predated the written treaties and therefore sat above them. Pack dominion said that any alpha who could defeat the reigning king in a single combat had the right to claim the crown. It said nothing about the method of combat. It said nothing about the condition of the challenger. And it said, in the clause that everyone in the assembled courtyard knew was the reason this delegation had arrived today and not any other day, that a king who refused challenge within 72 hours of its formal issuance was deemed to have forfeited. Forfeiture meant the crown passed without combat. The Iron Teeth delegation stood in the outer courtyard in their formal war leathers, 7 of them, broad and well-armed and carrying the calm of people who had very recently received extremely useful intelligence about their opponent. The senior delegate, a man with the Iron Teeth clan marks cut into the skin of his forearms and the eyes of a long-term strategist, watched Selim S. return from the road with an expression that was almost congratulatory. They had known he was away. They had timed this precisely. Seraphine stood at the edge of the returning group and watched the courtyard and the delegation and Selim S. face and did the mathematics that she always did when a situation presented itself. The Iron Teeth Alpha Lord was not here in person. That was the detail that mattered. The delegation carried the challenge, but the Alpha Lord himself had not come, which meant he intended to fight on his own terms and schedule once acceptance was given, not in the immediate heat of the moment. It also meant he was afraid of something. Selim received the delegation in the war chamber. Seraphine was not invited. She attended anyway, finding a position at the back of the room near the secondary door, and no one asked her to leave because she had, in 4 days of travel, established a presence that the Crown operatives had simply begun to incorporate into their spatial awareness without questioning it. The formal challenge was read aloud by the senior delegate in the old language, which Seraphine had spent 2 years of her running years teaching herself from stolen texts, and she followed every word. Selim listened without expression. When the reading was complete, the room waited. "The accepted," he said. "Combat in the old form. Full shift. Open ground. The challenge floor at the Meridian Plain, neutral territory, in 48 hours. The senior delegate made a note. The terms are acceptable. One condition from the challenger: no Crown operatives present at the combat site. The fight proceeds with witnesses only." "Accepted," Selim said again. The delegation withdrew. The room waited until they had cleared the gate, and then everyone spoke at once, the senior advisors and the guard commanders, and Yara Stonefeld with her journal already open, and Selim cut across all of it with a single raised hand. 48 hours to prepare. He looked at Yara. "I want everything on the Iron Teeth Alpha Lord's combat history by tonight." He looked at his senior guard commander. "Prepare the Meridian escort." He looked around the room. "We continue." They continued. Seraphine left the room and went to the East Quarter courtyard and stood in the cold air and thought. Full shift combat. The old form. She had seen full shift combat 3 times in her life, and each time it had been extraordinary and terrible. 2 massive wolves in the grip of every instinct they carried, fighting with the complete physical authority of the animal form. Which in mature adult wolves was a thing of devastating capability. She had never seen Selim shift. She had no way of knowing the shape of his wolf form, the weight of it, the speed. She knew his human form was trained and precise and carried power in it. That was not the same as knowing his wolf. She knew what she knew about the Iron Teeth Alpha Lord from 6 weeks of intelligence work. His name was Gareth Ironfell. He was 43 years old. He had fought 11 dominance challenges in 20 years of Alpha tenure and had won all of them, 7 in full shift. He was documented at 6'4" in human form. His wolf form had been described by every witness account she had assembled as enormous and dark and almost unnaturally fast for his size. He also, according to the pattern of those 11 challenges, had a specific tactical preference. He created controlled chaos in the opening of a combat. He used his size and aggression to set the pace and the energy of the fight in the first 30 seconds, pulling his opponent into a reactive pattern, and then he exploited that pattern with precision strikes to specific anatomical targets. He had done it 11 times. He would do it again. Unless his opponent knew to expect it. She went to Selim's war chamber that evening. The room was occupied by himself and Yara and 2 advisors. She knocked on the open door and all 4 looked at her and she walked in anyway. Gareth Ironfell opens the same way every time, she announced. I have the documentation. She set the assembled notes on the table in front of Selim, pages she had written from memory over the past hour, the witness accounts reconstructed and cross-referenced. He overwhelms the opening 30 seconds to establish a reactive pattern and then he targets the left flank specifically. Every time. Even when his opponent knows it is coming, he relies on the size differential to make it work regardless. The advisors looked at her with varying degrees of surprise. Yara did not look surprised. Selim looked at the papers. He went through them with the focused speed of someone who reads intelligence reports the way other people read sentences. He turned the last page and looked up at her. Where did you get this? 6 weeks of observation in and around Ironteeth territory, she answered. I was not only tracking silver supply lines. He held her gaze for a long time. Then he looked at his advisors. Leave us. They left. Yara, whose expression suggested she had seen this coming, left last and closed the door with the discretion of long practice. Selim set the papers down and stood and looked at her across the table. Why? He asked, and the word carried more weight than its single syllable suggested. She met his gaze. The Pale Conclave supplied the Ironteeth with silver. You told me yourself the Pale Conclave was responsible for the fire that killed your family. If Gareth Ironfell takes the crown with Pale Conclave backing, there is no independent northern power left to stand between them and every Omega, every unaffiliated wolf, everyone who cannot protect themselves against what comes next. She paused. Also, she said quietly, I do not want you to die. The war chamber held them. He came around the table. Not quickly. Not with any of the urgency she might have expected. He came around the table the way he moved through every space he occupied, taking up exactly what he needed and no more, and he stopped in front of her. He was very close. His visible eye, the gray-blue one, was doing something she had no more space left to file away. She looked up at him and did not look away. His hand came up and touched her face, just his fingers against her jaw, a contact so specific and so carefully made that she felt the entirety of it like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. He held her face and looked at her. The scarred side of his face was fully visible in the firelight. She saw it and she saw him and she brought her hand up to cover his where it rested against her jaw. She pressed his hand to her face. He breathed out, slow and unsteady and entirely unlike the controlled precision she had catalogued over every hour she had spent in his presence. You are the most unexpected thing, he told her, his voice stripped of the court resonance it always carried, reduced to something that belonged only to the 2 of them in this room. She found, for the first time in a very long time, that she did not need to answer with words. She stood on her toes and kissed him. It was brief and it was honest, and when she came back down to her heels he stood very still with his forehead touching hers and both his hands on her face. There is a fight in 36 hours, she noted. I am aware, he confirmed. She pulled back enough to look at him. You will not enter the opening 30 seconds on his terms. You will give him the chaos he expects and you will brace and redirect on the left flank strike. Your wolf is faster than any account suggests because every account is from observation and observation always underestimates. His hands came away from her face slowly. How do you know that last part? Because you move in human form the way wolves who shift exceptionally well always move. Your transitions from form to function are too clean. They suggest a wolf form that cooperates fully with the mind. He looked at her for a long time. Train with me tonight, he said at last. The full shift forms. I want to show you something. She stepped back and held his gaze. Show me. She had never seen anyone shift the way he shifted. The training ground behind the fortress was open to the sky, a large cleared space designed for exactly this purpose, and he shifted in the center of it with his back to her and she watched the whole of it with the attention she had given to everything about him since the first night. Most wolves shifted with visible effort, the change working against the body before it worked with it, the transition zone of the partial shift uncomfortable and awkward and often loud with the sound of biological change. Even the strongest alphas she had witnessed showed the seams of the process. Selim shifted like breathing. Like something that had been happening continuously beneath the human surface and only needed to be acknowledged. There was a moment of transition and then the wolf was simply there, standing in the training ground in the moonlight, and she understood why every witness account had underestimated. His wolf form was enormous. Not in the brute way of the iron-teeth wolves she had encountered, not the barrel-chested battering ram shape of wolves bred for mass. He was long and deep-chested and built on a frame that suggested something between a great hunting animal and a force of nature, his coat the color of dark walnut and charcoal, his eyes in this form the same pale gray-blue. He looked at her. She felt the weight of it like a hand pressed flat against her chest. She had shifted twice in her life. Both times badly, both times in desperation, and the shift had cost her something each time in the days afterward, a deep physical exhaustion and a mental fragmentation that took days to resolve. She had learned to live without her wolf form because her wolf form was unreliable in the ways that could get you killed. She had never been trained. He shifted back to human form and stood and looked at her and she understood what he was asking. She held his gaze and then she closed her eyes. She stopped fighting it. That was the only instruction she had ever been able to extract from the experience. The ones that went well had been the times she had stopped fighting the change and let it happen, and every time it had cost her she had been bracing against it, managing it, trying to control a process that did not respond to control. Stop fighting. Let it happen. The shift came up from the inside of her like a tide and instead of pressing against it she moved with it, and it was not violent, it was not the painful fragmentation she had dreaded for years, it was an opening, a door she had been holding closed from the wrong side, and she let go of the door and stepped through. The wolf she became was not large by the standards of trained pack wolves. She was lean and swift and the color of dark honey and old amber, and she stood in the training ground and breathed the night air and felt the whole world arrive in a different register, deeper and more specific and profoundly alive. She looked at him. He was very still. His expression in the training ground torchlight was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen a person wear. She shifted back. The transition was clean, cleaner than anything she had managed before, and she stood in her human form in the training ground and took a breath and felt the rightness of what had just happened settle through her like the resolution of a cord held too long. She looked at him. "You have been holding that," he said. "Your entire life." She breathed out. "No one showed me how not to." He crossed the training ground to her in a few strides and there was nothing measured or controlled about the way he pulled her to him, nothing professional, and she did not require it to be, because she was done keeping this at a distance that she had already crossed in every way that mattered. She held on. He held on. The night held them both. The Meridian Plain at dawn was the kind of place that had witnessed history enough times to stop being impressed by it. It was flat and wide and gray in the early light, the long grass standing still in the cold air, the sky above it vast and colorless and waiting. The witnesses assembled on either side of the combat line, Ashen Crown on the north, Iron Teeth on the south, every face carrying the particular expression of people who understood that what happened in the next hour would determine the shape of the next decade. Seraphine stood on the crown side near Yara Stonefeld and watched Gareth Ironfell arrive from the southern end of the plain. He was as she had catalogued him. Large, purposeful, carrying the settled confidence of a man who had never lost. He wore no court ceremonials, only the practical leather of a fighter, and he moved with the ease of someone in their own element. He looked across the plain at Selim and his mouth made the shape of a man acknowledging something he had already concluded was inevitable. Selim had removed the iron mask. This was not expected. The entire assembled witness line went very still. He stood at the north end of the combat line in the gray dawn light with his whole face visible, the scarred right side and the unmarked left, and he looked across the plain at Gareth Ironfell with the expression Seraphine had come to understand was not coldness but compression, everything he contained held in and held together. She understood what removing the mask meant. It was not vanity and it was not performance. It was declaration. The mask was a wall he had built between what he was and what the world was permitted to see. Removing it before a fight that would determine everything was a statement about what he was willing to put at stake. Not just his territory. Not just his crown. Himself. She pressed her hand flat against her own sternum and breathed. The combat mediator, an elder of the neutral Meridian clan, read the terms aloud in the old language and asked for acknowledgement from both parties. Gareth Ironfell raised his right hand. Selim raised his. The mediator stepped back. Both men shifted. The ground seemed to respond to it, a physical change in the air above the plain, the way storms change the pressure before they arrive. Two massive wolves stood on the gray grass in the dawn light, and even the most seasoned witnesses on both sides of the line made the involuntary small movements of people in the presence of something that reminded them what wolves actually were. Gareth Ironfell's wolf was dark gray and enormous, wide through the shoulders as two normal wolves side by side, and he began the opening exactly as he always did, a controlled aggressive surge designed to set the pace, to fill the first 30 seconds with overwhelming physical pressure. Seraphine counted under her breath. Selim gave him the first 20 seconds. He moved, he absorbed, he kept the distance tight but not committed, and Gareth Ironfell's aggression built to the point that Seraphine could feel the pattern of it from the witness line, the gathering of it toward the left flank strike. Gareth lunged. Selim moved. Not away. The wrong direction for any wolf following instinct and training. He moved into the lunge, inside the reach of it, and the transition was exactly what she had known it would be, the clean absolute cooperation of a wolf and a man who had made their peace with being the same thing, and the redirect was so precise that Gareth Ironfell hit air and the momentum of his own strike carried him past and down. What followed was 40 seconds. Seraphine had watched 11 accounts of Gareth Ironfell's dominance combats and none of them had lasted less than 4 minutes. 40 seconds. When it was over, Selim stood in the center of the Meridian Plain in wolf form over the prone and submitted shape of the Iron Teeth Alpha Lord, and the witness line on both sides was so quiet that she could hear the grass moving in the cold air. He shifted back. He stood in the gray dawn light with his whole face exposed and his chest rising and falling from exertion, and he was the most purely real thing she had ever seen. The mediator raised her voice across the plain. The Ashen Crown holds. The Iron Teeth witnesses made no sound. The Crown witnesses made a great deal of sound. Yara Stonefeld let out a breath beside Seraphine that had been held since the combat started. Seraphine did not make any sound. She was already walking. She crossed the combat ground from the witness line without entirely deciding to, and by the time she arrived at the center of the plain, Selim had seen her coming and stood still and waited. She stopped in front of him. His face was still completely uncovered, the whole of it in the growing light of early morning, and he looked at her with the expression she had first seen in the war chamber over her mother's coat, the expression that lived in the territory beyond professional and measured and controlled. She reached up and put her hand against the scarred side of his face. He closed his eyes. She held her hand there and felt the warmth of him and the particular quality of stillness that a person makes when they are receiving something they have not allowed themselves to need. When he opened his eyes, they were very bright in the gray light. She held his gaze and let him see everything that was in hers. Around them the plain was moving into the morning business of a concluded combat, witnesses from both sides processing toward their respective camps, voices rising in the practical tones of people working out what comes next. No one approached the center ground. They had, for a moment, the extraordinary privacy of two people standing in plain sight in a place no one else was yet ready to be. She thought about 6 years of running. She thought about her mother's voice saying go and not stopping. She thought about what it meant to have kept running for that long and to find, at the end of a witchlight border on the worst night of a particular bad month, a place where the ground did not ask her to flee. She thought about an iron mask and a hand extended in the old way and a man who had built everything he was on what he could not save. She thought about how it felt to shift without fighting it. To let go of the door and step through. His hand covered hers where it rested against his face. He turned his head very slightly and pressed his lips to her palm. It was the softest thing she had witnessed him do. It undid something in her chest that had been closed for 6 years. She stepped forward and he put his arm around her and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed him in, cedar and iron and the cold clean smell of morning, and she felt the weight of his arm across her back and the way he held her like she was both precious and capable, and he knew the difference. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then, very quietly, into her hair, "Stay." Not a command. Not a king's directive. A question from a person who understood exactly what they were asking. She thought about it genuinely, the way she thought about everything that might matter, turning it over, examining it, measuring the weight. She thought, she had run for 6 years because her mother had told her to, and her mother had been right, and she had survived. She thought, she was still running. She thought. The witchlight border had read her intent and let her through, and her intent had been survival, and maybe survival had been building towards something different than she had understood. She lifted her head from his shoulder. She looked at his whole face in the morning light, the scarred and the unmarked and the pale grey-blue eyes and the jaw like carved stone and the mouth she had kissed in the war chamber in the firelight. She said, 3 conditions. Something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile but lived in the neighborhood of one. Speak them. I operate independently within the pack structure, she told him. I do not take a designation that overrides my own judgment. I keep my own knife. She paused. And no one tells me what I am or am not capable of on the basis of what I was born. He held her gaze for a long time. Then he raised his right hand between them, palm up. The old way. Accepted, he said. She placed her hand in his. The plain stretched around them in the growing morning, gray and wide and permanent. The sky above was beginning to change color at the eastern edge, the first real warmth of the day arriving late and certain, the way things that matter always arrive. She thought about her mother. She thought about what it meant that the running could end not in defeat but in finding somewhere worth the stopping. She thought, I did not stop. I arrived. His hand closed around hers. She did not let go. And the meridian plane held them both in the morning light, the king without his mask and the Omega who had never needed one, 2 people who had built themselves entirely on what they could survive, discovering in each other the thing that survives most completely. The possibility of staying.